The night was quiet, almost eerily so, until the first crackle of fire shattered the stillness. A luxury SUV parked outside an upscale suburban home erupted into flames, sending thick plumes of black smoke spiraling into the sky. The explosion startled neighbors from their routines. Some stumbled out in bathrobes, others clutching phones to dial emergency services. "It's Jessica's car," someone shouted, pointing at the inferno. "She parks it here every Friday." The crowd grew restless, murmurs rippling through the gathering like wildfire itself. Children were ushered indoors, while adults exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. This was personal. As firefighters arrived, battling the blaze with torrents of water, one figure stood apart from the chaos. Claire Bennett lingered on her front lawn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. Her face bore no trace of panic or shock, only a hollow calm that seemed unnatural, given the scene unfolding before her. Claire's presence, or rather, her detachment, did not go unnoticed. Her hair was disheveled, strands escaping what had once been a neat ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes, a wrinkled blouse and jeans, looked hastily thrown on. She didn't flinch as embers floated toward her, nor did she offer any explanation when Mrs. Peterson, a nosy neighbor, approached her. "Claire, are you all right?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice tinged with concern, but also curiosity. "I'm fine," Claire replied flatly, her gaze fixed on the burning vehicle. Her tone lacked conviction, leaving Mrs. Peterson unsettled. "You don't look fine," Mrs. Peterson pressed. "Do you know anything about this? Who would do something like this?" Claire turned to her then, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she said softly, though there was something in her voice, a flicker of defiance, perhaps, that made Mrs. Peterson step back. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably before Claire added, almost under her breath, "Maybe some things burn for a reason." Mrs. Peterson frowned but said nothing more. Instead, she retreated to join the other neighbors, whispering about Claire's strange behavior. By now, speculation had spread faster than the flames themselves. "Did you hear?" Karen whispered to another neighbor, leaning close to avoid being overheard. "Mark hasn't been himself lately. He's always working late or golfing. And have you seen how distant he is with Claire?" Her companion nodded knowingly. "There's talk of another woman. Someone younger. Jessica, maybe." The mention of Jessica's name sent ripples through the group. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. A luxury car owned by a younger woman, torched outside a neighborhood where gossip thrived like weeds. "She's his co-worker," someone else chimed in. "They've been spending a lot of time together at work functions." "And now this happens," Karen muttered, casting a wary glance at Claire, who remained rooted to her spot on the lawn. "If I were her—" She trailed off, shaking her head. But Claire wasn't listening. Or if she was, she gave no sign. Her focus never wavered from the flames which continued to consume the SUV. To the outside world, Claire Bennett was the epitome of suburban perfection. She volunteered tirelessly for the PTA, organized bake sales, and chauffeured her 2 children to soccer practice and piano lessons without complaint. But behind closed doors, her life was unraveling. For years, she'd felt trapped in a cycle of monotony, her identity reduced to roles she no longer recognized. Wife, mother, caretaker. Mark's growing distance had only deepened her loneliness. Once affectionate and attentive, he now treated her like furniture, something familiar yet easily ignored. Their conversations had become transactional. Dinner's ready, Claire would say, placing a plate in front of him. Thanks, he'd reply, barely looking up from his phone. She longed for the man he used to be, the one who held her hand during long walks, who kissed her forehead after arguments, who promised her forever. That man was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. And then came the texts. Late one night, unable to sleep, Claire had picked up Mark's phone to check the time. What she found instead changed everything. Messages filled the screen, each one more damning than the last. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. You're all I think about. The sender's name burned into her memory. Jessica. That discovery ignited something inside Claire. Rage, despair, and a desperate need for control. Every message she read felt like a match struck against her soul, fueling the fire already smoldering within her. At first, she tried to confront him. Who is she? Claire demanded one evening, holding up his phone. Mark froze, guilt flashing across his face. It's not what it looks like, he stammered. Then what is it? She shot back, her voice trembling. Because it sure as hell doesn't look innocent. He didn't answer, choosing instead to storm out of the room. That moment marked a turning point. Claire realized pleading wouldn't bring him back, and forgiveness wouldn't erase the betrayal. Something inside her snapped, and the idea of revenge took root. Tonight's fire was the culmination of weeks of planning, sleepless nights, and endless internal debates. As she watched the SUV burn, she couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. For once, she was in control. But even as the flames died down, questions lingered in the air like smoke refusing to dissipate. Who lit the match? Why was Claire so composed amidst the chaos? Detective Ryan arrived shortly after the fire department, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. When he approached Claire, his tone was measured but probing. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, pulling out a notebook. "Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" Claire hesitated, her mind racing. I heard a loud noise and came outside. By the time I got here, the car was already on fire. Ryan studied her carefully, noting the tension in her posture, the way her hands clenched at her sides. "And you didn't see anyone suspicious around?" "No," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. For now, Detective Ryan let it drop, but Claire knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the crowd dispersed and the streetlights flickered on, Claire returned to her house, closing the door behind her. Alone in the darkness, she leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow. What had she done? And more importantly, what would happen next? Claire Bennett lived a life that looked flawless from the outside. A husband who seemed devoted, children who excelled in school, and a home so pristine it could grace the pages of a magazine. But perfection was an illusion, one she maintained at great personal cost. Every morning, Claire rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for her family, ensuring each plate was arranged just right. She volunteered tirelessly for PTA events, organized charity drives, and attended every soccer game and piano recital with unwavering dedication. To her neighbors, she was the epitome of suburban success. Yet beneath the surface, Claire felt suffocated by the weight of societal expectations. Each smile she plastered on her face hid a growing emptiness. Her identity had been reduced to roles: wife, mother, caretaker, and she feared there was nothing left of the woman she used to be. The demands on Claire were relentless. Between managing her children's schedules, organizing fundraisers, and keeping up appearances, she rarely had a moment to herself. Every task chipped away at her sense of self-worth until she felt like little more than a machine designed to meet everyone else's needs. One afternoon, as she folded laundry in silence, Emily stopped by unannounced. "You look exhausted," Emily said gently, sitting beside her. "I'm fine," Claire replied automatically, though dark circles under her eyes betrayed her words. "Are you sure?" Emily pressed. "You've been running yourself ragged lately. Maybe take some time for yourself." Claire forced a smile. "There's no time for me. There's barely enough time for everyone else." Emily frowned but didn't push further. Still, her words lingered long after she left, stirring something restless inside Claire, a yearning for freedom she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Mark wasn't always distant. In the early days of their marriage, he'd been affectionate and attentive, making Claire feel cherished. But over time, his focus shifted. Work consumed him, and weekends were spent golfing with colleagues rather than spending time with his family. When he was home, he barely acknowledged Claire beyond perfunctory greetings. Conversations dwindled to logistics, bills, schedules, grocery lists. Intimacy became a distant memory, replaced by cold indifference. Another late night, Claire asked one evening as Mark grabbed his keys. "Yeah, big project deadline," he muttered without looking at her. She bit back a retort, swallowing the lump in her throat. What was the point of arguing? He wouldn't listen anyway. Loneliness settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating yet familiar. She craved connection, validation, but not from Mark, from anyone who would remind her she still mattered. Late one night, unable to sleep, Claire reached for Mark's phone on the nightstand. Suspicion had been brewing for weeks. His evasive answers, the late-night texts, the way he flinched whenever she mentioned Jessica's name. Her stomach churned as she unlocked the screen. The messages stared back at her, stark and damning. "Can't stop thinking about last night. When can we meet again?" Each word sliced through her like a knife, shredding what little remained of her trust. Betrayal burned hotter than anger, igniting a storm of emotions she couldn't contain. Humiliation followed close behind. How many people knew? Had they whispered about her behind her back, pitying the clueless wife? Tears blurred her vision as she scrolled further, finding evidence of dates, plans, even declarations of love. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but instead, she sat frozen, clutching it like a lifeline. When Mark walked in moments later, she confronted him. "What is this?" she demanded, shoving the phone into his hands. His face paled. "Claire, Don't!" she snapped, cutting him off. "Just don't." He stammered excuses, but none of them mattered. The damage was done. Jessica entered Claire's consciousness like a shadow, looming larger with each passing day. Young, ambitious, and unapologetically bold, she represented everything Claire wasn't. Or perhaps everything she once dreamed of being. Through snippets of conversation and online stalking, Claire pieced together Jessica's life, her rapid rise at work, her glamorous social media posts, her calculated charm. It infuriated her how easily Jessica had slipped into Mark's orbit, exploiting his vulnerabilities with ruthless precision. Was it really about love, or was it power? Claire wondered bitterly. Did Jessica enjoy dismantling marriages, watching lives unravel around her? Or was she simply opportunistic, seizing what she wanted without regard for consequences? The questions haunted Claire, fueling her obsession. She hated Jessica, not just for stealing Mark, but for embodying a version of herself Claire feared she'd lost forever. Desperate for solace, Claire confided in Emily, spilling her heart over coffee one afternoon. "He's cheating on me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "With someone younger, someone better." Emily listened quietly, her expression softening with empathy. "I'm so sorry, Claire. That must be devastating." "It's not just that," Claire continued, tears streaming down her face. "It's like I don't even know who I am anymore. I gave up everything for this life, for him. And now?" Emily reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers. "You deserve better than this. You deserve happiness." But Claire shook her head. "Happiness isn't enough. I want justice." Emily hesitated, sensing the dangerous edge in Claire's tone. "Be careful, okay? Revenge might feel good in the moment, but it won't fix anything." Claire nodded absently, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. Detective Ryan arrived on the scene shortly after the fire, his sharp eyes scanning for clues amidst the chaos. Though initially focused on gathering evidence, he couldn't help but notice Claire's peculiar demeanor, the calmness that bordered on detachment. As firefighters doused the last embers, Ryan approached her, notebook in hand. "Mrs. Bennet," he began, his tone neutral but probing. "Mind telling me what happened here tonight?" Claire hesitated, weighing her response carefully. "I heard a loud noise and came outside. By the time I got here, the car was already on fire." Ryan studied her closely, noting the tension in her posture, the faint tremor in her hands. "And you didn't see anyone suspicious around?" "No," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. For now, Ryan let it drop, jotting down notes. But something about Claire's demeanor lingered in his mind, a nagging suspicion that refused to fade. Little did Claire know, Detective Ryan's instincts were razor sharp, and sooner or later, he'd uncover the truth behind the flames. The cracks in Claire and Mark's relationship deepened with each passing day. Societal pressures and unmet emotional needs fueled Claire's despair, pushing her closer to the edge. One evening, during a rare moment when both were home, Claire confronted him again. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. Mark sighed, avoiding her gaze. "It's not that simple, Claire. You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," she shot back. "Because all I see is someone who doesn't care about me or our family anymore." He opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, shaking his head. Their silence spoke volumes. The fragile foundation of their marriage had crumbled, leaving only bitterness and regret in its wake. Claire realized then that revenge wasn't just about punishing Mark. It was about reclaiming control over a life that had spiraled out of her grasp. Claire's world narrowed to a single focus: Jessica. Every waking moment became consumed by thoughts of her, the way she laughed in photos, the confidence radiating from her social media posts, the ease with which she had infiltrated Claire's life. Unable to sleep, Claire spent hours scrolling through Jessica's online presence, piecing together fragments of her existence like a detective chasing leads. She memorized details about Jessica's routines, her favorite coffee shop, the yoga studio she frequented, even the brands of clothes she wore. It wasn't just curiosity. It was an obsession born out of jealousy and rage. Each discovery fueled Claire's paranoia, making her feel smaller, more insignificant. One night, as she sat hunched over her laptop, Claire whispered to herself, "Who are you to take everything from me?" Her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. The line between reality and obsession blurred. Claire began imagining confrontations, rehearsing arguments in her head. She told herself she needed answers, but deep down, she craved vengeance. As Claire delved deeper into Jessica's life, unsettling questions surfaced, not about Jessica, but about herself. Had she ever truly been happy? Did Mark's love for her exist at all? Or was it merely a facade? These doubts gnawed at her sanity, twisting memories until they felt foreign. She replayed moments from the marriage, the vacations, the anniversaries, the quiet evenings, but now saw cracks where none had seemed to exist before. Was his laughter genuine? Or had he always been distant? Her mind spiraled into resentment. How could I have been so blind? She muttered bitterly, staring at old family photos. Isolation compounded her despair. Friends stopped calling, sensing her withdrawal. Even her children noticed her growing detachment, though they couldn't understand it. Claire found solace only in one thought. If Mark no longer loved her, then neither would anyone else. And if that were true, why should she care what happened next? Determined to reclaim control, Claire devised a plan to confront Jessica directly. She waited outside the coffee shop Jessica frequented, rehearsing lines in her head. When Jessica finally appeared, Claire stepped forward, her hands trembling. "You need to stay away from my husband," Claire demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. Jessica smirked, unfazed. "Or what? You'll cry about it some more?" The casual dismissal cut deeper than any insult could. Claire clenched her fists, fighting back tears. "This isn't a game. He's married. To me." Jessica tilted her head, studying Claire with cold amusement. "If he wanted to be with you, don't you think he'd choose you? Face it, sweetheart. You lost him long before I came along." Humiliated and enraged, Claire stormed off, vowing never to let Jessica win. But the encounter left her shaken, her resolve hardened into something darker. Overwhelmed by powerlessness, Claire turned to alcohol and prescription pills to dull the ache inside her. At first, it was just a glass of wine after dinner, a harmless indulgence. Then 2 glasses, then 3. By the time Emily visited again, Claire's erratic behavior was impossible to ignore. "You're scaring me," Emily said gently, watching Claire down another pill with a shaky hand. "I'm fine," Claire snapped, though her bloodshot eyes betrayed her lie. Emily hesitated, unsure how to help. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. Please talk to someone." "There's nothing wrong with me," Claire shouted, slamming her glass onto the counter. Emily recoiled, hurt but unwilling to give up. "I'm worried about you, Claire. This isn't who you are." But Claire didn't hear her. All she could think about was silencing the voices in her head, the ones whispering betrayal, failure, revenge. Mark remained oblivious to Claire's unraveling, dismissing her mood swings as stress or menopause. When she snapped at him during dinner, he sighed and shook his head. "What's your problem lately?" he asked, exasperated. "My problem?" Claire shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe it's living with someone who doesn't give a damn about me." "Don't start," Mark warned, avoiding eye contact. "Why not? Afraid of the truth?" He stood abruptly, tossing his napkin onto the table. "I don't have time for this." As he walked out, Claire felt a surge of hatred, not just for him, but for herself. How had she let things get this far? Fueled by humiliation and despair, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. Late at night, while everyone slept, she researched arson techniques online, absorbing information like a student preparing for an exam. She purchased gasoline cans and matches, hiding them in the garage behind boxes of holiday decorations. No one would suspect a thing. Each step of her plan brought a twisted sense of satisfaction. For the first time in months, she felt in control. "This ends tonight," she whispered to herself, staring at the supplies. But doubt lingered at the edges of her mind. What if she got caught? What if someone got hurt? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the image of Jessica's car engulfed in flames. Emily noticed Claire's increasingly erratic behavior and pleaded with her to seek help. "You're not okay, Claire," Emily said urgently during one of their rare conversations. "Please, let me call someone." "No," Claire interrupted sharply. "You don't understand. No one does." "Then explain it to me," Emily begged, tears welling in her eyes. "Let me help you before it's too late." But Claire pushed her away, convinced that Emily's concern was misplaced. "Just leave me alone," she said coldly. Hurt and frustrated, Emily left, wondering if she'd already lost her friend forever. Claire's secretive actions didn't go unnoticed. Strange receipts appeared among her belongings, unexplained absences raised eyebrows, and late-night internet searches hinted at something sinister brewing beneath the surface. Detective Ryan, reviewing evidence from the fire, stumbled upon a lead connecting Claire to recent purchases of flammable materials. "She's hiding something," he muttered to himself, jotting down notes. Meanwhile, neighbors whispered about Claire's odd behavior, piecing together clues without realizing the full picture. The tension mounted, building toward an inevitable explosion. Torn between guilt and rage, Claire reached a breaking point. Rational thought dissolved, replaced by raw emotion. Sitting alone in her kitchen, she stared at the photograph of her family on the fridge. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry." But apology wasn't enough anymore. Revenge had taken root, consuming her completely. With trembling hands, she packed the last of her supplies and prepared to leave. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her like a slap, grounding her momentarily. "This is it," she thought, steeling herself. "There's no turning back." The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Claire moved through the shadows, her footsteps muffled by thick socks. She paused outside her children's bedroom door, listening to their soft breathing. They were safe, for now. Her hands trembled as she slipped into the garage, retrieving the gasoline cans and matches she'd hidden days earlier. Each item felt heavier than it should, weighed down by the gravity of what she was about to do. She stepped outside, the cool night air biting at her skin. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest as she walked toward Jessica's car, parked outside the local bar where Mark and Jessica often met. Every step felt deliberate, yet surreal, as though she were watching herself from a distance. Claire glanced over her shoulder, scanning the empty street. No one was around. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe this might work, that justice could be hers if she just followed through. Kneeling beside the sleek SUV, Claire unscrewed the cap of the first gas can. The sharp smell of fuel filled the air, making her stomach churn. As she poured the liquid over the vehicle, doubt crept in, like an unwelcome guest. Would this bring her peace? Or would it only deepen the void inside her? Her hands froze mid-pour. What was she doing? This wasn't who she was. Or at least, it wasn't who she used to be. But then images of Mark and Jessica flashed in her mind, their laughter mocking her, the betrayal slicing open old wounds. "No," she whispered, shaking off the hesitation. "They deserve this. But even as she spoke the words, they rang hollow. Revenge wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't erase the pain or restore what she'd lost. Still, she couldn't stop. Not now. Claire struck the match, its flame flickering against the darkness. Just as she lowered it toward the soaked car, headlights swept across the parking lot. A passerby had spotted her. "What are you doing?" A voice called out, startling her. Panicked, Claire dropped the match and bolted, leaving behind the gas cans, and the receipt tucked inside one of them. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Someone had called 911. By the time she reached home, adrenaline coursed through her veins, but guilt clawed at her insides. She hadn't planned for this, not really. And now there was no going back. Mark was waiting for her when she slipped back inside, his face pale with shock. "Claire, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, holding up his phone. Frantic texts from Jessica lit up the screen. "I don't know what you're talking about," Claire lied, avoiding his gaze. "Don't lie to me," Mark snapped, his voice rising. "Jessica says someone tried to burn her car. And guess what? It happened right outside the bar we always go to." Claire flinched at the accusation, anger bubbling beneath her surface. "Always go to? You mean the place where you cheat on me?" Mark's eyes widened. "You knew?" "Of course I knew," Claire shouted, her composure crumbling. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't care?" The argument spiraled out of control, years of resentment spilling forth like floodwaters breaking through a dam. "You ruined us," Claire screamed, tears streaming down her face. "You chose her over me, over our family." "And you think setting her car on fire fixes that?" Mark shot back, incredulous. "This isn't about her. It's about you. Your jealousy, your obsession." "My obsession?" Claire laughed bitterly. "I'm not the one sneaking around behind my spouse's back." Mark shook his head, disgust etched into his features. "You've completely lost it. Do you even realize what you've done? You've destroyed everything." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. Destroyed everything. Wasn't that exactly what she'd set out to do? To make him feel the same pain she'd endured? As the weight of her actions crashed down on her, Claire sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "What have I done?" she choked out, clutching her head in her hands. Mark stared at her, equal parts anger and pity. "You need help, Claire." Real help. But Claire barely heard him. All she could see was the image of the burning car, hear the sound of the sirens, feel the heat of the flames licking at her conscience. She had wanted revenge, but now all she felt was regret. Sitting alone in the dim light of the living room, Claire realized the truth. There was no undoing what she'd done. The fire wasn't just meant to punish Jessica. It was meant to reclaim control over her life. But instead, it had consumed her. Every choice she'd made since discovering Mark's affair led her here, to this moment of reckoning. The woman she once was, the devoted mother, the loyal wife, was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. And yet, despite the chaos she'd unleashed, she felt strangely numb. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the windows, Claire remained seated on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a broken record. The gasoline, the match, the sirens. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life, unaware of the storm brewing within her home. Somewhere detectives were piecing together clues, drawing closer to the truth with each passing hour. For Claire, the world had shifted irreversibly. The fire symbolized more than destruction. It marked the unraveling of her entire existence. She didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The knock on the door came early in the morning, shattering what little peace remained in Claire's life. Detective Ryan stood there, flanked by two uniformed officers, his expression grim but resolute. "Claire Bennett, you're under arrest for arson," he said, reading her rights as she stared at him in stunned silence. Neighboring curtains twitched as Claire was led out of her home in handcuffs, her face pale and drawn. Whispers rippled through the community like wildfire itself. How could Claire, the quintessential soccer mom, be capable of such destruction? For some, it was disbelief. For others, vindication. Either way, the arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, leaving everyone questioning what they thought they knew about the woman next door. Inside the courtroom, Claire sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The trial unfolded with brutal honesty, exposing not just her crime, but the toxic dynamics that had driven her to it. Testimonies revealed years of emotional neglect from Mark, who had prioritized work and infidelity over his family. Friends spoke of Claire's growing isolation, her descent into obsession, and her reliance on alcohol and pills to cope. She felt invisible, Emily testified, her voice trembling, like no one saw her pain, not even those closest to her. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of calculated revenge, reckless disregard for safety, and an inability to take responsibility for her actions. As the evidence mounted, Claire struggled to reconcile the person she once was with the stranger now sitting in the defendant's chair. When Mark took the stand, his testimony cut deeper than any accusation. "I never imagined she'd go this far," he admitted, avoiding eye contact with Claire. "But I can't ignore what she did. She endangered lives, including Jessica's." His words hung heavy in the air, forcing their children to confront painful truths about their parents' fractured relationship. "Why didn't you tell us?" their teenage daughter whispered later, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't either of you fix it?" Caught between loyalty and disillusionment, the children retreated into silence, unsure whom to blame or forgive. Outside the courthouse, debates raged among neighbors. Some sympathized with Claire, citing societal pressures and the invisibility many women faced in suburban life. Others condemned her actions as unforgivable, arguing that personal grievances didn't justify endangering others. "She snapped because no one listened," Karen argued passionately. "And burning someone's car is the answer?" Mrs. Peterson countered. "Where does it end?" The moral ambiguity of Claire's case divided the community, sparking conversations about accountability, forgiveness, and the unspoken struggles faced by so many behind closed doors. Months later, Emily visited Claire in prison, finding her thinner, quieter, and visibly worn down. They sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by glass and regret. "I'm sorry," Claire murmured, her voice barely audible. Emily reached out, pressing her hand against the barrier. "I forgive you, Claire, but you need to forgive yourself too, and think about how your choices affected everyone around you." Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to truly grieve, not just for what she'd lost, but for everything she destroyed along the way. Their conversation underscored a harsh truth. Redemption wasn't easy, and healing would take time, if it came at all. Revenge, Claire realized too late, was a double-edged sword. What began as an act of defiance against betrayal had spiraled into something far darker, a consuming force that left her life in ruins. As she sat alone in her prison cell, the weight of her choices pressed down on her chest like a stone slab. She had sought to punish Mark and Jessica, to reclaim control over a life she felt slipping away. Instead, she had destroyed everything she once held dear: her family, her freedom, her sense of self. The fire she set wasn't just meant to burn a car, it was meant to purge years of pain. But fire spread indiscriminately, consuming not only their intended targets, but also those who ignite them. A question lingered in Claire's mind, haunting her like a ghost. What happens when we let our darkest impulses guide us? She thought back to the night of the fire, the gasoline can in her trembling hands, the match striking against the striker. In that moment, she hadn't considered consequences or collateral damage. All she'd wanted was retribution, a fleeting taste of power amid her helplessness. But justice and vengeance were not the same thing. Justice sought fairness. Vengeance sought destruction. And now, as she faced the fallout of her actions, Claire understood the difference all too well. Her story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily unchecked emotions could unravel lives, leaving devastation in their wake. Could healing ever follow such profound betrayal? Claire wrestled with this question daily, staring at the cracked ceiling of her cell as if searching for answers etched into the plaster. Betrayal had shattered her marriage, her trust, her identity. Could forgiveness mend what had been broken? Or were some wounds simply too deep to heal? She thought of Mark, his testimony cutting deeper than any blade, of her children caught in the crossfire of adult failures, of Emily offering forgiveness, but urging reflection. Perhaps healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting responsibility, finding meaning in the wreckage, and learning to live with the scars. But for Claire, that journey felt impossibly distant. In the quiet solitude of her cell, Claire clutched a photograph of her children, their smiling faces frozen in time. Tears streamed down her cheeks as grief overwhelmed her, not just for the life she'd lost, but for the one she destroyed. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, though no one was there to hear her. The image encapsulated everything she regretted: moments missed, trust broken, love squandered. Her children would grow up without her, their memories of her tainted by shame and disappointment. For the first time since the fire, Claire allowed herself to truly grieve, for her mistakes, for her losses, for the person she used to be. And in that grief lay a glimmer of hope. Acknowledgement. Perhaps redemption started here, in the willingness to confront the truth and bear its unbearable weight.